there's this common question or idea of what would you tell your younger self? Kind of looking back through all your experience and with all the information you have now, what would you tell your younger self to put current you in a better spot? And as much as I understand like the point of the question, I think the point is, right, it's not necessarily to, I guess, like wallow in what mistakes you made. It's more of like to tell other people about maybe your life experience or the mistakes you made or the things you regret, or also just kind of like to tell other people about your story and maybe give them an idea of what would have been the better scenario in their case. I feel like a lot of the time with this question, it's usually someone who's older who's kind of giving the answer to someone younger. The idea kind of being, maybe I can help this younger person live a life with less regrets or not doing the same mistakes that I made. And while I've heard some people say, oh, it doesn't really matter what I would tell my younger self wouldn't listen. I think that captures part of what I want to talk about. It really gets at the idea that when you're younger and when you're learning and experiencing new things, you don't really have the foresight, or you just don't really care to hear about how you could do things better or how you could go a different way. It's kind of like you're in that moment, you're doing your thing, and God be damned if anyone tells you different. And I guess if I was to say one thing, is that like, if I was to tell my younger self one thing, it would be, don't tell your younger self anything. As someone who's very, and always kind of has been very future oriented, very goal oriented, always looking at what I could improve, I really wouldn't go back and tell my younger self kind of anything. And I think the main reason for that is so many of the lessons and so many of the things I've learned in my life can kind of only really be understood through experience. Like, you hear so much advice when you're younger from other people about, you know, what's the most optimal way to do this thing, or what's the better thing to do. And at least in my experience, I've kind of like rejected, I wouldn't say all of them, but I've rejected a bunch of those. I feel like everyone does, right? Because you don't really understand why they're telling you the thing. I think a lot of the time, the advice that people give is kind of, it's not really explained. It's more just told, and you're supposed to understand it. And when you're younger and you don't really have that much life experience, and you hear these kind of lessons or these kind of ideas of, oh, you should do this thing, and it's not explained, it's just not convincing, right? And I think the problem is the people that are kind of giving this advice or telling these stories are kind of explaining it to you as if they think you have their experience, right? They don't understand that they're talking to someone who doesn't know the whys of that advice. And this is really why I wouldn't tell my younger self anything, honestly. Is that I feel like so many things have to be kind of experienced to understand why they're done a specific way. There's this kind of concept that I think came up with. I don't know. It's hard to know what you come up with versus, you know, ideas that you like take from other people. But there's this idea I like to think about, at least, called emotional experience, or emotional understanding versus logical understanding. And so a lot of things you can kind of logically understand. Like, I can understand why doing something might lead to a better outcome. But sometimes, unless you go through that experience and you live through that and you emotionally feel the goods and the bads of that experience, you don't really understand kind of the consequences or why you should do that thing. And I feel like this is where a lot of the kind of disconnect comes when it comes to talking to your younger self. And why your younger self, I feel like a lot of the times won't listen to older you, is because while older self may be able to logically explain why you should do something or you should do, make a decision so that you won't have regrets, younger you doesn't emotionally understand. They haven't been through that experience. They haven't felt that pain or felt that joy. And so they don't really have a reason to listen to you. Everyone always says that like hindsight is 20/20, and I feel like this is the epitome of that, is telling your younger self something. Like, it's so easy to see in retrospect what the good decisions were, what you should have done. But you can only kind of do the best you can in that moment. And I think that's something I try to live my life by, is not regretting the decisions I've made in the past. You were kind of only given the tools and the choices and the mindset you had in that moment. There's only so much you can control. And while I do think, you should try and... I've always been a future-oriented person, so I'm always like looking at all the future possibilities when I make decisions and stuff like that. And so I think it's definitely a good thing. But when you do make mistakes or you do make suboptimal decisions, I think it's important to realize that you only had what was available to you in that moment to make that decision. And that those bad decisions or those times you fucked up, like, those build that emotional experience. Those build your understanding of yourself, who you are, and they give you kind of the tools to understand how to not make, say, a mistake or a bad decision in the future.